They said a woman who couldn't bear children was cursed by God himself. But as Virginia Mitchell felt the frozen earth closing around her throat, she wondered if the real curse was the cruelty of those who called themselves righteous. The December wind cut through Cedar Falls like a blade forged in hell's own furnace, carrying with it the promise of a death so slow and deliberate that even the coyotes had retreated to their dens. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, each flake a tiny verdict cast down from a sky that had long since abandoned mercy. Virginia's breath came in shallow puffs, each exhale a small rebellion against the packed earth that held her prisoner from the shoulders down. They dug the hole precisely, deep enough to send a message, shallow enough to call it mercy. Her head protruded from the frozen ground like a grotesque flower blooming in winter, her auburn hair now white with snow, her lips the color of old bruises. 6 hours. That's how long she'd been here, watching the last of the torches disappear into the blizzard as the good people of Cedar Falls retreated to their warm homes and clear consciences. The tribunal had been swift, the verdict unanimous among the war veterans who governed their small Washington Territory settlement with the rigid discipline they'd learned in Union camps. A barren woman brings God's curse upon the community, Colonel Harper had declared, his weathered face stone cold in the firelight of the town hall. 3 years of marriage, not even a miscarriage to show the Lord's mercy. That ain't natural, and what ain't natural ain't welcome in Cedar Falls. The memory burned hotter than the coal that was slowly claiming her fingers, her toes, creeping inward like an advancing army. Virginia had stood before them all, 37 men who'd bled for the Union, who'd earned their land grants with rifle and saber, who'd built the settlement from nothing but timber and determination. She'd tried to speak, tried to explain that wanting a child and being able to bear one weren't the same thing, that her heart broke a little more each month when her monthly courses came like clockwork, regular as rain. But they hadn't wanted explanations. They'd wanted solutions. "Robert Mitchell's a good man," Pastor Williams had added, his voice heavy with what he surely believed was righteousness. "Fought at Antietam, earned his captain's bars honest. He deserves a wife who can give him sons to carry on his name, not some hollow vessel." Hollow vessel. The words echoed in Virginia's mind now, mixing with the howl of the wind and the distant memory of her husband's voice that final morning. "I should have known," Robert had said, unable to meet her eyes as he packed his few belongings. "Should have seen the signs. My mother warned me about women who smile too much, talk too much about other people's babies. She said they're usually hiding something broken inside." He'd left for Oregon Territory the next day, taking with him the marriage certificate and what little remained of Virginia's reputation. The divorce papers had arrived by railroad post 2 weeks later, along with a note that cut deeper than any blade. "Find yourself a spinster's life, Jenny. It's all you're suited for now." The tribunal had given her one final chance: leave Cedar Falls voluntarily and never return, or face the community's justice. She'd chosen poorly, they said, chosen pride over practicality, and now she would learn the price of defying the natural order that God himself had established. A sound caught her attention, distant but growing closer. Hoofbeats, steady and sure despite the storm. Virginia's heart lurched with desperate hope. Perhaps someone had come back. Perhaps the pastor's wife had convinced the men that this was too cruel, even for a barren woman. But as the sound grew nearer, she recognized the rhythm. One horse, one rider, moving with the confidence of someone who knew these trails well. Not the careful gait of townspeople venturing into a blizzard, but the steady pace of a man who belonged to the wilderness. The rider emerged from the white curtain of snow like a ghost made flesh. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a heavy coat that had seen years of hard use. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, snorted steam into the frigid air as its rider dismounted and approached her half-buried form. Virginia tried to speak, tried to call out, but her voice had been scraped raw by hours of wind and cold. All that emerged was a broken whisper, barely audible above the storm. The man knelt beside her, and for the first time in hours, Virginia felt something other than despair. His eyes, visible beneath the brim of his hat, held no judgment, no disgust at finding a woman buried like refuse in the town square. They held something far more dangerous than either. they held pity. And in that moment, as he began to dig with his bare hands, Virginia Mitchell realized that sometimes salvation came not from the righteous, but from those who understood what it meant to be broken. Benjamin Blackwood had seen enough death to recognize it from a distance. The way it settled over a person like morning frost, stealing warmth inch by inch until nothing remained but the shell of what once was. He'd watched good men die in muddy Confederate trenches, seen children waste away from fever in army camps, held his own wife's hand as life bled out of her during the worst blizzard Washington Territory had seen in decades. But he'd never seen someone buried alive in a town square, and the sight of Virginia Mitchell's head protruding from the frozen earth hit him like a rifle butt to the chest. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, dismounting Thunder with practiced efficiency. His boots crunched through the snow as he approached, each step measured and deliberate. Years of military training had taught him to assess a situation before acting, but the woman's blue-tinged lips and glassy stare cut through his caution like a blade through silk. She tried to speak when he knelt beside her, but only a broken whisper emerged from her throat. Her eyes, green as pine needles and just as sharp, tracked his movement with desperate awareness. Still fighting then. Still alive enough to hope. "Easy now," Benjamin said, his voice carrying the same steady calm he'd used with wounded soldiers and frightened horses. "I'm going to get you out of there." He began digging with his bare hands, the frozen earth feeling like concrete beneath his fingers. The cold bit through his leather gloves, but he'd endured worse. Much worse. At Fredericksburg, he dug trenches in December mud while Confederate artillery screamed overhead. This was just dirt and snow, and the only enemy was time. "What's your name?" he asked, partly to keep her conscious, partly to fill the terrible silence that surrounded them like a shroud. Virginia," she managed, the word barely audible above the wind. "Well, Virginia, I'm Benjamin Blackwood. Most folks call me Ben." He pulled away another handful of packed earth, revealing more of her shoulders. "I own the lumber mill about 2 miles north of town. You probably heard the saws running if you've been in Cedar Falls long." She nodded slightly, and he caught something flickering in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or relief that he was talking to her like a person instead of a problem to be solved. "This your idea of a winter evening activity?" he asked, attempting humor as he worked. "Because I've got to tell you, there are warmer ways to spend a December night." A sound escaped her that might have been laughter if it hadn't been so broken. "Wasn't my choice." The words confirmed what Benjamin had already suspected. The good people of Cedar Falls had done this. His neighbors, the men he traded with, the veterans who'd supposedly learned honor and duty in the crucible of war. They'd buried a woman alive and left her to freeze, and somehow that knowledge hurt worse than the cold. "Well," he said, his voice hardening, just enough to let her know where he stood, "it's my choice to get you out, and I've never been one to leave a soldier behind." It took 20 minutes to free her completely, 20 minutes during which the storm showed no mercy, and Virginia Mitchell's breathing grew increasingly shallow. By the time Benjamin pulled her from the earth, her skin had taken on the waxy pallor of severe hypothermia, and her limbs moved with the sluggish coordination of someone whose body was shutting down. "Can you ride?" he asked, already knowing the answer from the way she swayed when he helped her stand. I think so." She couldn't, of course. The moment he released her, her legs buckled like wet twine. Benjamin caught her before she could fall, lifting her with the ease of a man accustomed to hauling timber and wrestling lumber into place. She weighed almost nothing, too little for a woman her age, and he wondered when she'd last eaten a proper meal. "Thunder's gentle as a church hymn," he said, settling her in front of him on the saddle. "Just lean back and let him do the work." The ride to his mill took 40 minutes through terrain that would have challenged a healthy rider in daylight. Benjamin guided Thunder with one hand while keeping the other arm firmly around Virginia's waist, feeling her gradually relax against him as his body heat began to penetrate the cold that had settled in her bones. She didn't speak during the journey, and Benjamin didn't press her. He'd learned in the war that sometimes silence was the greatest kindness you could offer someone. Words had a way of making pain sharper, more real. Better to let the rhythm of the horse and the steady beat of his heart remind her that she was alive, that someone had chosen to care whether she lived or died. The Blackwood Mill sat in a clearing surrounded by towering cedars, the main house built from the same lumber Benjamin processed for shipment to Seattle and Portland. Smoke curled from the chimney, a welcoming sight that meant his housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had kept the fires burning despite the late hour. More importantly, it meant his children were warm. Benjamin dismounted first, then reached up to help Virginia down. Her feet hit the ground, but her legs refused to support her weight. Without hesitation, he swept her up again, carrying her toward the front door. "I have children," he said, wanting to warn her before they encountered the chaos that four young ones could create. "They might be asleep, but babies don't always respect a man's hopes." As if summoned by his words, a thin cry drifted from inside the house. Thomas, no doubt, demanding his late-night feeding. Benjamin felt Virginia tense in his arms, and when he glanced down, he saw something unexpected cross her face. Not fear or annoyance, but a kind of hungry longing that made his chest tighten. Mrs. Patterson appeared at the door before Benjamin could knock, her gray hair escaping from its pins and her apron dusted with flour from evening baking. She took one look at the woman in his arms and stepped aside without a word. "Hot water," Benjamin said as he carried Virginia toward the main room, "and whatever soup's left from dinner. She's been out in the cold for hours." "Hours?" Mrs. Patterson's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman who'd raised 6 children and buried 2. "What in heaven's name?" "Later," Benjamin cut her off, settling Virginia in the chair closest to the fireplace. "Right now she needs warmth and food in that order." The baby's crying intensified, joined now by the sleepy fussing of one of the twins. Benjamin moved toward the nursery, but Virginia's voice stopped him. "I can help," she said, her words still slurred from cold but stronger than before. "With the baby, if you want." Benjamin studied her face in the firelight, noting the way her eyes tracked toward the sound of Thomas's cries, with the instinctive attention of someone who understood children. "You sure? You're barely warmed through yourself?" "Please." The word carried more weight than a simple request. It sounded like a prayer. He nodded, disappearing into the nursery and returning with Thomas bundled in a thick blanket. The 8-month-old was red-faced and furious, his tiny fists waving with indignation. Benjamin had gotten better at managing the bottles and diaper changes in the years since Emily's death. But comfort, the kind that came from gentle hands and softer voices, remained beyond his capabilities. Virginia took the baby without hesitation, settling him against her chest with movements that spoke of experience. Thomas quieted almost immediately, his crying subsiding to whimpers and then to the soft snuffling sounds of a child finding peace. "You're good with him," Benjamin observed, sinking into the chair across from her. "I like children." Virginia's voice was wistful, carrying undertones of loss that Benjamin recognized from his own mirror. "Always have." Mrs. Patterson bustled in with a steaming bowl of beef stew and a cup of hot coffee, setting both on the small table beside Virginia's chair. "Eat," she commanded with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Your skin and bones." Virginia managed to eat one-handed while continuing to hold Thomas, who had drifted back to sleep against her shoulder. Benjamin watched the interplay, woman, child, and the peculiar magic that seemed to flow between them, and felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "The storm's getting worse," Mrs. Patterson said, pulling back the curtain to peer out into the white darkness. "Won't be safe for traveling until morning at least." Benjamin nodded, though his attention remained fixed on Virginia and the way she unconsciously swayed with Thomas, humming a tune so soft it was barely audible above the crackling fire. "You can take Emily's room," he said. "It's small, but it's warm and the bed's comfortable." Virginia looked up at him, surprise flickering across her features. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Benjamin replied. "I know someone buried you alive in a blizzard, and I know you're good with children. That's enough for tonight." She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read the motivations written there. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Benjamin, for everything." "Ben," he corrected, "and you don't need to thank me for being decent. That should be the baseline, not the exception." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and testing the strength of the walls Benjamin had built to keep his family safe. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, something had begun that neither of them fully understood yet. A reckoning with the past, perhaps, Or maybe just the first tentative steps toward a future neither had dared to imagine. Time would tell which it was. Time and the choices they would make when morning came and the storm finally passed. Dawn broke gray and reluctant over the Blackwood Mill, filtering through windows that hadn't seen a woman's touch in over a year. Virginia woke to the sound of children's voices, a symphony of demands, questions, and the particular brand of chaos that only comes from young ones who have learned the world revolves around their immediate needs. She lay still for a moment in Emily Blackwood's bed, surrounded by the ghostly remnants of another woman's life. A hairbrush on the dresser, still threaded with strands of dark hair. A book of poetry marked with a ribbon that would never move again. A wedding photograph showing Benjamin younger, cleaner shaven, his arm around a petite woman with kind eyes and a smile that suggested she'd never doubted her place in the world. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. Emily Blackwood had been everything Virginia wasn't. Small where Virginia was tall, dark where Virginia was fair, and most crucially, fertile where Virginia was barren. The children's voices served as a constant reminder of Emily's success, her fundamental worth as a woman, but those same voices called to something deep in Virginia's chest, something that had withered during 3 years of marriage to Robert Mitchell, but had never quite died. A crash from the main room sent her scrambling from bed, pulling on the simple brown dress Mrs. Patterson had left folded on the chair. She found Benjamin in the kitchen, baby Thomas in one arm, while he attempted to salvage what appeared to be the remains of breakfast from the floor. 2 identical 3-year-olds, the twins Jake and Lucy, stood nearby with the satisfied expressions of children who'd successfully executed a plan. "We were helping," Lucy announced, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she nodded solemnly. "We carried the eggs," Jake added, gesturing toward the yellow mess now decorating the pine floor. Benjamin's jaw was tight with the particular strain of a man who'd been fighting a losing battle since before sunrise. "Helping," he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Right." 5-year-old Emma appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and holding a wooden doll that had seen better years. She took in the scene with the weary expression of an eldest child who'd grown used to disappointment. "They always do that," she said to Virginia, as if continuing a conversation they'd started years ago. "Papa says they're learning, but I think they just like the noise." Virginia stepped into the kitchen, careful to avoid the scattered eggshells. "May I?" she asked Benjamin, reaching for Thomas. He handed over the baby with visible relief, and Virginia settled the fussing infant against her shoulder while surveying the domestic disaster. "Emma, could you show me where your father keeps the cleaning rags?" "You don't have to," Benjamin began. "I want to," Virginia interrupted gently. "Let me help." The next hour unfolded like a careful dance between strangers, learning each other's rhythms. Virginia cleaned the egg mess while Benjamin prepared a second attempt at breakfast. Emma proved to be a reliable assistant, fetching supplies and keeping her younger siblings from creating new disasters. The twins, once redirected toward appropriate tasks like setting napkins on the table, revealed themselves to be helpful in their chaotic way. "You're good at this," Benjamin observed as they sat down to breakfast. Actual breakfast this time, consisting of Johnny cakes, bacon, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "I had younger cousins," Virginia replied, cutting Jake's Johnny cake into manageable pieces. "Before the war, when there were still family gatherings to attend." She didn't elaborate, and Benjamin didn't press. The war had scattered families like leaves in a windstorm, leaving everyone with stories they'd rather not tell and absences that ached like phantom limbs. After breakfast, Benjamin prepared to leave for the mill proper, a collection of buildings about a quarter-mile from the house, where the actual lumber processing took place. "Mrs. Patterson will be back this afternoon," he said, shrugging into his heavy coat. "She has her own family to tend to in the mornings, but she'll help with the children after lunch." "What about until then?" Virginia asked. Benjamin paused in the doorway, Thomas beginning to fuss in his arms. "Emma's good with the twins, and Thomas usually sleeps after he's fed. I'll come back if—" "I could stay," Virginia said quietly. "Help with the children until Mrs. Patterson arrives." The offer hung in the air like morning mist, full of implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. Benjamin's children needed care. That much was obvious. But accepting help from a woman the town had literally buried alive carried risks he wasn't sure he could afford. "You sure?" he asked finally. "They can be a handful." Virginia looked around the room at the four small faces, watching their conversation with the intensity of children who understood that adult decisions shaped their world in ways beyond their control. Emma's hopeful expression, the twins' matching grins, Thomas's sleepy contentment, all of it tugged at something in her chest that had been dormant too long. "I'm sure," she said. Benjamin nodded, kissed each of his children goodbye, and disappeared into the gray morning, leaving Virginia alone with the family she'd never been able to create. The morning passed more smoothly than she'd dared hope. Thomas napped in his cradle while the twins played with wooden blocks near the fireplace. Emma helped Virginia with small household tasks, sweeping, organizing, mending a torn seam in one of Jake's shirts, and chattered about everything from her doll's imaginary adventures to her father's work at the mill. "Mama used to sing while she sewed," Emma said, watching Virginia work. "Do you know any songs?" Virginia's needle paused mid-stitch. "A few. Would you like to hear one?" She sang softly while she worked, lullabies her own mother had taught her, folk songs from before the war, hymns that spoke of grace and redemption, rather than judgment and condemnation. The twins gradually drew closer, eventually settling at her feet like puppies seeking warmth. It was Lucy who broke the spell. "Are you going to be our new mama?" she asked with the devastating directness of childhood. Virginia's hands stilled. She looked down at the little girl's earnest face, then at Jake, who was nodding hopefully, then at Emma, who was watching with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust good things to last. "I'm just visiting," Virginia said carefully, "helping your papa until he doesn't need help anymore." "But Papa always needs help," Jake pointed out with unassailable logic. "That's why Mrs. Patterson comes, and why Mama went to heaven instead of staying to help more." The simplicity of it, the way children could reduce complex adult realities to their essential truths, left Virginia momentarily speechless. She was saved from having to respond by the sound of horses approaching the house. Through the window, she could see 3 riders picking their way carefully up the snowy path. Even at a distance, their posture spoke of official business, the kind that rarely brought good news to families like the Blackwoods. "Emma," Virginia said quietly, "take your brother and sister to your room. Stay there until I come get you." Emma's eyes widened, but she obeyed without question, herding the twins toward the back of the house with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to recognize adult worry. Virginia lifted Thomas from his cradle, holding him close as she watched the riders approach. They dismounted in front of the house with deliberate ceremony. Colonel Harper, Pastor Williams, and a third man Virginia didn't recognize. All 3 wore the serious expressions of men who'd come to deliver judgment rather than seek conversation. The knock, when it came, was firm and official. Virginia opened the door with Thomas in her arms, meeting their surprised stares with steady composure. "Gentlemen, Miss Mitchell," Colonel Harper's voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We need to speak with Benjamin Blackwood." "He's at the mill," Virginia replied evenly. "Working." "Then you'll do," Pastor Williams interjected, his pale eyes fixed on the baby in her arms. "We've come about your situation." "My situation?" "Your presence here," the colonel clarified. "In this house with these children. People are talking, Miss Mitchell. Questions are being asked about the propriety of an unmarried woman living under the same roof as a widower and his family." Virginia felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her voice level. "I'm helping care for the children. Surely that's not scandalous." "Everything about you is scandalous," the third man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the nasal twang of someone who'd appointed himself moral guardian of the community. "A woman buried for barrenness, taken in by a man with 4 children? It looks improper at best, corrupting at worst." Thomas stirred in her arms, making the soft, mewing sounds that preceded crying. Virginia bounced him gently, her movements automatic despite the tension coiling in her chest. "And what would you have me do?" she asked. "Leave these children without care while their father works? Let them fend for themselves because my presence offends your sensibilities?" "We'd have you leave," Colonel Harper said bluntly. "Cedar Falls has made its position clear regarding your condition. Benjamin Blackwood may have acted from misguided kindness last night, but harboring you permanently serves no one's interests. The baby began to cry in earnest now, and Virginia found herself swaying instinctively, humming the same tune she'd sung earlier. Thomas quieted almost immediately, settling against her shoulder with a contented sigh. Pastor Williams watched the interaction with narrowed eyes. "That's precisely what concerns us," he said. "A barren woman playing at motherhood. It's unnatural, Miss Mitchell, an affront to God's design." "Is it God's design for children to go uncared for?" Virginia asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "For a good man to struggle alone with burdens too heavy for one person to bear?" "Better that than corruption," the colonel replied. "We'll speak with Blackwood this afternoon. Make our position clear." They left without another word, riding back toward town with the satisfied air of men who'd done their duty, regardless of the cost to others. Virginia stood in the doorway, holding Thomas, watching them disappear into the gray morning, and wondering how long she had before Benjamin was forced to choose between his community and the woman they'd left for dead. Behind her, Emma's small voice broke the silence. "Are you leaving now?" Virginia turned to find all three children watching her with the careful attention of those who'd learned that adults disappeared without warning, that love was a luxury that could be revoked at any moment. "Not today," Virginia said firmly. "Not today." But as she closed the door against the cold, she wondered if that promise would prove to be another lie in a world that seemed determined to deny her every chance at belonging. Benjamin returned from the mill as the afternoon light began its early winter retreat, his boots heavy with sawdust, and his mind heavier still with the conversation he'd had with his foreman. Word of Virginia's presence had already reached the workers, men who depended on Cedar Falls for their livelihoods and couldn't afford to cross the town's leadership. He found her in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she rolled dough for what smelled like apple pie. The domestic scene should have been comforting, but the tension in her shoulders told him that her day hadn't been as peaceful as it appeared. "They came," she said without looking up from her work. "Colonel Harper and Pastor Williams, and another man I didn't recognize." Benjamin hung his coat by the door, his jaw tightening. "What did they want?" "For me to leave." Virginia's rolling pin moved with mechanical precision, working the dough thinner than necessary. "They're concerned about propriety, about the influence a barren woman might have on your children." The clinical way she said the word barren, as if it were a medical diagnosis rather than a judgment on her worth as a human being, made something twist in Benjamin's chest. He'd heard that tone before, in field hospitals where wounded men spoke of their injuries with detached acceptance, as if describing someone else's pain. "Where are the children?" he asked. "Napping. All of them, if you can believe it." A small smile flickered across her face. "I think I tired them out with stories and songs." Benjamin poured himself coffee from the pot that always seemed to be ready these days, another small miracle he was becoming accustomed to. "What stories?" "Fairy tales mostly, the ones where the lonely people find each other and the broken things get mended." She paused in her rolling, looking out the window at the gathering dusk. "Children like those stories better than the true ones." "Most people do." Virginia glanced at him, noting the weight in his voice. "But not us." Benjamin settled into the chair across from her workstation, cradling his coffee like a lifeline. "I stopped believing in fairy tales somewhere between Antietam and Fredericksburg. What about you?" She was quiet for a long moment, transferring the rolled dough to a pie tin with practiced efficiency. "The day the doctor told me I'd never carry a child," she said finally, 3 years ago after my second miscarriage. "He was very kind about it, very gentle. But kindness doesn't change facts." "You had miscarriages?" Benjamin's voice was softer now, edged with understanding rather than curiosity. "2. Both early, both." She stopped, her hands stilling over the pie crust. "Robert said they didn't count. That losing something you never really had wasn't the same as real loss. The doctor agreed that it was probably for the best, considering my constitution." Benjamin set down his coffee cup with more force than necessary. "That's not loss." "Not real?" "According to the tribunal, no. They said a woman who couldn't even hold on to a baby for 3 months had no business calling herself a mother." Virginia's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the counter. They said I was cursed, that my womb was a grave that killed hope. The words hung between them like smoke from a bitter fire. Benjamin had heard cruel things during the war. Men said terrible things when they were scared or angry or dying. But this was different. This was calculated cruelty, delivered by people who claimed to speak for God. My wife died in a blizzard, he said suddenly. Not unlike the one you were buried in. Virginia looked up, her green eyes reflecting a pain that matched his own. It was February, exactly a year ago. Emily had been having pains for hours, but the midwife couldn't get through the storm. I knew something was wrong, had known it for days if I'm being honest, but Emily kept saying everything was fine, that women had been having babies since the beginning of time. Benjamin stood, moving to the window where he could see the snow beginning to fall again, each flake a tiny reminder of that terrible night. When Thomas finally came, he wasn't breathing. Emily was bleeding too much, and I had to choose, try to save the baby or help her. She made the choice for me, grabbed my hands and pressed them to Thomas's chest, told me to breathe life into him, said she'd rather die knowing he lived than live knowing he didn't. Virginia had stopped working entirely. Her attention focused on Benjamin with an intensity that made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since Emily's funeral. It took 10 minutes to get Thomas breathing properly. By then, Emily was unconscious. She died an hour later. Never got to hold him properly, never heard him cry. Benjamin's voice cracked slightly. I buried her in the same storm that brought him into the world. The preacher said it was God's will, that Emily had served her purpose. Her purpose? Virginia's voice was sharp with indignation. To give me a son, to complete my family before returning to her heavenly rest. Benjamin turned from the window, his blue eyes dark with old anger, as if she was nothing more than a vessel, as if her laughter, her kindness, her stubborn refusal to let me win at checkers, as if none of that mattered compared to her ability to bear children. Virginia crossed to him without thinking, her flour-dusted hands reaching for his, before she could second-guess the impulse. It mattered, she said fiercely. She mattered, just like your grief matters, and your struggle matters, and the way you're raising her children matters. Her children. Benjamin looked down at their joined hands, noting how perfectly Virginia's long fingers fit between his. Sometimes I can barely remember what she looked like. But Thomas has her eyes, and Emma has her laugh, and the twins have her stubborn streak. They're pieces of her, walking around in small bodies that need more than I know how to give. You're giving them love, Virginia said. Safety, stability. You're teaching them that they matter enough for their father to work himself to exhaustion just to keep them fed and warm. Is that enough? The question carried the weight of a year's worth of doubt, of nights when crying children overwhelmed his abilities, of moments when he wondered if Emily would have made different choices, better choices. It's everything, Virginia whispered. It's more than I ever had, even when I was married. Robert loved the idea of me, the potential of what I might give him, but he never loved me for what I was, just what I could produce. Benjamin turned his hand so that he was holding hers rather than being held. What were you? Before the marriage? Before the tribunal? Before all of this? Virginia smiled, and for the first time since he'd found her buried in the snow, it reached her eyes. I was the daughter of a bookkeeper who let me read everything in his shop. I could cipher numbers and write a fair hand, and I knew the capitals of all 38 states. I could bake bread that didn't turn to bricks and sew a straight seam, and I never met a child who didn't take to me eventually. That sounds like more than enough, Benjamin said quietly. Not for Robert, not for the town, not for anyone who mattered. She pulled her hands free but gently, as if reluctant to break the connection. I thought maybe if I could prove my worth some other way. Virginia. Her name on his lips was soft, careful. Your worth isn't something you have to prove. It's something you are. She looked at him then with an expression that was part wonder, part fear, as if he'd offered her something precious that she was afraid to accept. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the night that had brought them together. The men at the mill, Benjamin said, returning to the practical reality that governed their days. They're good men, but they have families to feed. If the town decides to make things difficult, You could lose your contracts, Virginia finished. Your livelihood. It's not just about money. The mill provides jobs for half the families in the area. If I'm forced to shut down, then you can't let that happen. Virginia turned back to her pie, adding sliced apples with movements that were almost violent in their precision. You can't sacrifice all of that for someone like me. Someone like you? Benjamin's voice sharpened. What does that mean? Someone broken, someone cursed, someone who brings nothing but trouble wherever she goes. Benjamin crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, his hands closing over hers to still their agitated motion. Look at me, he commanded, and when she reluctantly raised her eyes, he continued, You are not broken, you are not cursed, and you are not trouble. The town says, the town buried you alive in a snowstorm. The town's opinion is worth less than nothing. They stood frozen in that moment, hands intertwined over half-finished pie, breath mingling in the warm kitchen air. Benjamin could feel Virginia's pulse racing beneath his thumbs, could see the way her pupils dilated as he leaned closer. Benjamin, she whispered, and his name on her lips was both warning and invitation. He might have kissed her then, wanted to, with an intensity that surprised him. But the sound of Thomas crying from the nursery broke the spell, reminding them both of the children who depended on his judgment, the community that watched his every move, the impossible situation that had brought them together. I should... Virginia stepped back, smoothing her apron with shaking hands. Virginia. She paused at the doorway, looking back. Tomorrow I'm going to town, to speak with Colonel Harper myself. Benjamin, no. You'll only make things worse. Maybe, or maybe it's time someone reminded them what honor actually looks like. As she disappeared into the nursery to tend to Thomas, Benjamin stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the sense of home and the certainty that tomorrow would change everything. The only question was whether that change would destroy them or finally set them free. The town hall of Cedar Falls had seen its share of difficult conversations since the settlement's founding 5 years earlier. Veterans' tribunals for land disputes, disciplinary hearings for drunkenness and disorderly conduct, even the occasional debate over church doctrine. But the tension that filled the log building that gray Thursday morning was different. Thicker, more personal, charged with the kind of righteous anger that had once driven men to civil war. Benjamin Blackwood entered the hall with his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the rigid line of a man who'd made peace with an unpleasant duty. The assembled crowd, 37 men, all veterans, all property owners, all sworn to uphold the moral order of their community, turned as one to watch his approach. Colonel Harper sat at the front of the room behind a scarred oak table that had once served as a surgeon's station during the war. To his right sat Pastor Williams, his pale hands folded over an open Bible. To his left, Robert Mitchell, Virginia's former husband, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied air of a man who'd returned just in time to witness justice served. Benjamin, Colonel Harper's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded troops through 3 years of hell. Thank you for coming. Didn't seem like I had much choice, Benjamin replied, settling into the single chair that had been placed facing the tribunal. The arrangement was deliberately reminiscent of a court-martial, and everyone in the room understood the implication. You always have choices, Pastor Williams interjected, his reedy voice carrying across the silent hall. The question is whether you choose to honor your obligations to this community or continue down a path that serves only your own selfish desires. Benjamin's eyes found Robert Mitchell's face, noting the way Virginia's former husband avoided direct eye contact. And what path would that be, Pastor? The path of harboring a woman this community has judged unfit for decent society, Colonel Harper replied. A woman whose very presence corrupts the natural order God intended. By helping care for children? Benjamin kept his voice level, though his hands tightened on his hat brim. By keeping them fed and clean and safe while their father works to support them. By playing at being a mother when nature itself has declared her unworthy of the title. Robert Mitchell spoke for the first time, his voice sharp with old bitterness. By pretending that what God has cursed can be blessed by human sentiment. Benjamin turned to face his accuser fully. You're one to talk about God's blessings, Robert. Last I heard, your new wife in Oregon died in childbirth just 3 months after your wedding. Seems like the Almighty might have opinions about men who abandon their wives for failing to produce sons. The color drained from Robert's face, but Colonel Harper rapped his knuckles against the table before he could respond. We're not here to relitigate past decisions, Benjamin. We're here to address a present threat to the moral fabric of our community. What threat? Benjamin stood, his height and military bearing commanding the room despite his precarious position. The threat of a woman who sings lullabies to frighten children, who mends their clothes and makes sure they eat proper meals, who asks for nothing in return except a roof over her head and the chance to be useful. The threat of normalizing barrenness, Pastor Williams said, his voice rising with pulpit fervor, of teaching our children that a woman's failure to fulfill her divine purpose is acceptable, even admirable. Virginia Mitchell is a walking reminder that some souls are cursed by God himself, and harboring her corrupts the innocence of your children and the sanctity of your home. My children, Benjamin's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet, are happier and healthier than they've been since their mother died. They're learning, laughing, growing in ways I couldn't provide alone. If that's corruption, then maybe corruption is what they needed. A murmur rippled through the assembled men, some disapproving, others uncertain. Benjamin had allies in the room, men who'd worked alongside him, who'd seen him struggle through the past year of single parenthood. But he also had enemies, men who viewed any deviation from established order as a threat to their own authority. The children's temporary happiness is irrelevant, Colonel Harper declared. What matters is their moral education, their understanding of proper roles and divine will. How can they learn to respect God's design when you parade a living example of his disfavor before them daily? God's design? Benjamin's composure finally cracked, years of suppressed grief and anger blazing to the surface. Was it God's design for Emily to bleed to death in a blizzard while I chose between saving her and saving our son? Was it divine will that left me with 4 children under the age of 6 and no idea how to comfort them when they cry for their mother? The room fell silent, even Pastor Williams subdued by the raw pain in Benjamin's voice. Virginia Mitchell saved my family, Benjamin continued, his words cutting through the quiet like a blade. She saved me, and if that offends your sense of proper order, then maybe your order's the problem. Careful, Benjamin, Colonel Harper warned. You're walking close to blasphemy. And you're walking close to forgetting what honor actually means. Benjamin straightened, every inch the soldier he'd once been. I've fought beside most of you, bled with you, buried friends with you. And I thought that meant something. I thought it meant we understood that a person's worth isn't measured by their ability to conform to someone else's expectations. Robert Mitchell stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Honor? You want to talk about honor? I honored my marriage vows for 3 years, waiting for a wife who couldn't give me children. I honored my community's judgment when they declared her unfit. And I honored my duty to find a woman who could build a proper family. That's honor, Benjamin, not this sentiment you're peddling. Your honor killed 2 women, Benjamin said quietly. Virginia, who you abandoned when she needed you most, and your second wife, who died trying to give you the children Virginia couldn't. How many more women have to die for your honor, Robert? The accusation hit its mark. Robert's face went white, then red, his hands clenching into fists. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've seen what happens when men value pride over compassion, when they confuse cruelty with righteousness. I lived through a war that was supposed to be about honor, and I watched honor get twisted into an excuse for every atrocity imaginable. Pastor Williams stood, his Bible clutched against his chest like a shield. This is exactly what we feared. The woman's corruption has already begun. You're questioning divine authority, rejecting biblical truth, choosing personal desire over communal obligation. I'm choosing mercy over judgment, Benjamin replied. I'm choosing love over law. If that's corruption, then I'll take corruption over your version of righteousness any day. Colonel Harper rapped the table again, his face grave. Benjamin Blackwood, this tribunal finds your conduct detrimental to the moral order of Cedar Falls. You have 48 hours to remove Virginia Mitchell from your home and cease all contact with her. Failure to comply will result in the revocation of your business contracts, expulsion from community membership, and potential legal action regarding the custody of your children. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a burned offering. Benjamin felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. The loss of income, social isolation, the possibility of losing Emma, Jake, Lucy, and Thomas to families deemed more suitable by community standards. "And if I refuse?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you'll discover that honor is a luxury we can't afford to extend to those who reject it," Colonel Harper replied. "You have 48 hours, Benjamin. Use them wisely." Benjamin placed his hat on his head with deliberate ceremony, nodding once to the tribunal. "I'll give your ultimatum all the consideration it deserves." He walked out of the town hall with his head high and his heart breaking, knowing that the 48 hours had already begun, and that the hardest conversation of his life was waiting for him at home. Behind him, the murmur of voices rose like the sound of carrion birds gathering, and somewhere in that noise he heard Robert Mitchell's voice cutting through the rest. "He'll see reason. He has to. No man sacrifices everything for a barren woman." But as Benjamin mounted his horse and turned toward the mill, toward the home where Virginia waited with his children, he wondered if Robert Mitchell had ever understood what sacrifice actually meant, or if any of them had. The ride home took longer than usual, each mile a meditation on the choice that lay before him. By the time he reached the house, snow was falling again, and through the windows he could see the warm glow of lamplight and the silhouettes of the people who had become his whole world. Virginia appeared in the doorway before he could dismount, her face pale with worry. Behind her, Emma peeked out with the worried expression of a child who'd learned to read adult faces for signs of coming storm. "How bad?" Virginia asked, and Benjamin realized that she'd already accepted the worst-case scenario, was already preparing to disappear back into the snow from which he'd rescued her. "Bad," he admitted, dismounting slowly, "but not hopeless." "Benjamin!" 48 hours, he said, cutting off whatever sacrifice she was about to offer. "They've given us 48 hours to decide our future." "Us?" The word was barely a whisper. Benjamin looked at her standing in his doorway, holding his son, surrounded by the children who'd learned to call her name with joy instead of fear. He thought of Emily, who'd died believing in love over law, who'd spent her last breath ensuring that life continued even in the face of loss. "Us," he confirmed and stepped into the light. The clock on Benjamin's mantle ticked away the hours with merciless precision. 48 hours had become 36, then 24, then 12. Now, as dawn broke on the second day, only 8 hours remained before Colonel Harper's ultimatum expired and Virginia would have to disappear from their lives forever. She hadn't slept. Benjamin could tell from the careful way she moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone who was trying not to disturb anyone while her world collapsed around her. Her traveling dress lay folded on the chair where she'd placed it the night before. The same simple brown wool she'd worn when Robert Mitchell first abandoned her, now mended and cleaned, but still carrying the weight of all her failures. "You don't have to leave," Benjamin said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. The children were still asleep, giving them this brief moment of privacy in the gray pre-dawn light. "Yes, I do." Virginia's voice was steady, but Benjamin could see the tremor in her hands as she poured her own coffee. "I won't let you lose everything because of me. Your children need their father more than they need me." "What if I disagree?" She looked at him then, her green eyes holding all the pain of a woman who'd learned not to hope for more than she could reasonably expect. "Benjamin, be practical. You have a business, a reputation, a place in this community. I'm a woman who was buried alive for being barren. There's no comparison." Benjamin set down his coffee and crossed to where she stood by the stove, his hands finding her shoulders with the gentle insistence of a man who'd made up his mind about something important. "You're right. There's no comparison. My business is just work. My reputation is just other people's opinions. But you're the woman who brought laughter back into this house, who taught my children that gentleness and strength aren't opposites, who showed me that love doesn't always come in the package we expect." "Benjamin, I love you," he said simply, and the words fell between them like stones thrown into still water, creating ripples that would reshape everything they thought they knew about their future. I love your courage, your kindness, the way you hum while you work. I love how Emma lights up when you read to her, how the twins compete for your attention, how Thomas stops crying the moment you hold him. I love that you see worth in children who aren't yours by blood. And I love that you see worth in a man who's failed at almost everything except missing his dead wife. Virginia's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. Love isn't enough. It wasn't enough to make me fertile for Robert, and it won't be enough to make this town accept me. Then to hell with this town. Benjamin's voice was fierce, certain. Let them keep their narrow definition of worth. Let them judge and condemn and pat themselves on the back for their righteousness. I've found something better than their approval. I've found you. Before Virginia could protest again, the sound of small feet on wooden floors announced that their private moment was ending. Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed and holding her favorite doll, her 5-year-old face serious with the weight of adult concerns. Are you really leaving today? She asked Virginia directly, with the devastating honesty that only children possessed. Virginia knelt to Emma's eye level, smoothing the little girl's blonde hair with gentle fingers. I might have to, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult choices. But we need you, Emma said matter-of-factly. Papa burns the pancakes, and Mrs. Patterson doesn't know the songs you sing, and the twins don't listen to anybody else when they're being naughty. You managed before I came, Virginia replied softly. You'll manage after I leave. We weren't happy before, Emma said with the brutal clarity of childhood truth. We were just getting by. But now we're a real family again. The words hung in the air as Jake and Lucy tumbled into the kitchen, still sleepy but immediately gravitating toward Virginia as if she were the center of their small universe. She hugged them both, breathing in the sweet scent of children who felt safe enough to sleep deeply, and Benjamin watched the interplay with something breaking apart in his chest. This was what they would lose. Not just Virginia, but the wholeness she'd brought to their fractured family. The sense that they were more than the sum of their individual griefs. I have an idea, Benjamin said suddenly, his voice carrying the authority of a decision made under pressure. Get dressed, all of you. We're going to town. Virginia looked at him sharply. Benjamin, no. If you take me into Cedar Falls... I'm not taking you into Cedar Falls, he interrupted. We're going together, as a family. An hour later, they made their way down Main Street like a small parade of defiance. Benjamin drove the wagon with Virginia beside him, baby Thomas in her arms. Emma, Jake, and Lucy sat in the back, dressed in their finest clothes and holding themselves with the dignity of children who understood they were part of something important. Word of their approach spread faster than wildfire. By the time they reached the town square, the same square where Virginia had been buried just 3 days earlier, a crowd had gathered. Colonel Harper stood with his arms crossed, Pastor Williams beside him clutching his Bible like a weapon. Robert Mitchell lurked at the edge of the group, his face twisted with something that might have been jealousy or rage. But there were other faces too. Mrs. Patterson, who had quit her job at the general store that morning, rather than continue working for people who would bury a woman alive. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, who had lost his own wife in childbirth and understood something about the arbitrary cruelty of loss. Even young Dr. Morrison, who had recently arrived from Boston with modern ideas about medicine and mercy. Benjamin helped Virginia down from the wagon, then lifted each of his children in turn, setting them carefully on the ground beside their chosen mother. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was his family, complete and unified, standing together against whatever judgment the community chose to render. Benjamin Blackwood, Colonel Harper's voice carried across the square, you were given 48 hours to remove that woman from your home. The time has expired. You're right, Benjamin replied, his voice clear and strong. The time has expired, so I'll make this simple for everyone. He turned to Virginia, taking her free hand in both of his, while the crowd watched in stunned silence. Virginia Mitchell, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you be a mother to my children, a partner in my struggles, and the other half of whatever future we can build together? The proposal was not a surprise. Virginia had seen it coming in the way Benjamin had looked at her that morning, In the careful way he'd insisted they face this crisis together. But the public nature of it, the deliberate challenge to every social convention that governed their small world, took her breath away. "Benjamin," she whispered, "are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," he replied. "Not when I enlisted in the army, not when I married Emily, not when I decided to build a life in this territory. You are the best decision I never knew I was going to make." Virginia looked around the square, taking in the faces of the people who had condemned her. Some were angry, others uncertain. A few, Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Morrison, several of the younger veterans, were actually smiling. "Yes," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was not passionate or desperate, but it was complete. A sealing of promises made and accepted, a public declaration that love could triumph over judgment if people were brave enough to choose it. When they broke apart, Colonel Harper's face was thunderous. "This changes nothing, Benjamin. A marriage to a barren woman is still a mockery of God's design." "Then let God judge us," Benjamin replied. "As for you and your tribunal, your authority over my family ends here." Pastor William stepped forward, his pale face flushed with righteous anger. "You cannot simply dismiss the moral order of this community." "Watch me," Benjamin interrupted. Then louder, addressing the entire crowd. "Anyone who wants to trade with a man who chooses love over hate, who values mercy above judgment, who believes that a person's worth comes from their actions rather than their biology, my door is always open. Anyone who prefers the Colonel's version of righteousness is welcome to take their business elsewhere." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Benjamin was surprised to see more supportive faces than he'd expected. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward first, her weathered hands clapping slowly but deliberately. Dr. Morrison joined her, then Tom Bradley, then others. Not a majority, but enough to matter. Enough to suggest that Cedar Falls might be ready to choose compassion over condemnation. As the crowd began to disperse, some grumbling but others nodding approvingly, Benjamin helped his family back into the wagon. Virginia settled beside him with Thomas, while the three older children chattered excitedly about weddings and new mothers, and the adventure of defying an entire town. "So," Virginia said as they headed home, "when exactly are we getting married?" Benjamin smiled, the first genuinely carefree expression she'd seen from him since the day he'd dug her out of the snow. "How about tomorrow? I figure if we're going to scandalize the community, we might as well do it efficiently." "Tomorrow," Virginia repeated, tasting the word like honey. "Mrs. Benjamin Blackwood." "Has a nice ring to it," Benjamin agreed, and for the first time in 3 days, the future felt like something worth looking forward to. Behind them, Cedar Falls continued its daily business, but something had shifted in the cold February air. Love had declared itself publicly, choosing courage over convenience, and the reverberations of that choice would echo through the community long after the snow melted and spring returned to Washington Territory. The morning of Virginia and Benjamin's wedding dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline light that made the snow-covered landscape look like something from a fairy tale. It was February 15th, 1885, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Emily Blackwood had died in a blizzard, bringing Thomas into the world with her final breath. Virginia stood before the mirror in Emily's room, her room now, wearing the same blue dress she'd been married in before, the only formal gown she owned. Mrs. Patterson had worked through the night to alter it, taking in the waist that had grown thin during Virginia's months of hardship and adding delicate white lace at the collar and cuffs. "You look beautiful," Emma said from the doorway, her 5-year-old voice filled with the solemnity of someone who understood the importance of the day. She held a small bouquet of pine boughs and winter berries that she'd gathered herself, tied with a ribbon from her own hair. "Thank you, sweetheart." Virginia accepted the bouquet with hands that trembled only slightly. "Are your brothers ready?" "Jake got syrup on his good shirt, but Papa cleaned it off. Lucy's trying to teach Thomas to say mama, but he just keeps blowing bubbles." Emma climbed onto the bed, her small face serious. "Are you scared?" Virginia considered the question carefully. 3 days ago, she'd been buried alive in the town square, left to die for the crime of being unable to bear children. Today, she was about to marry a man she'd known for less than a week, in front of a community that had condemned her as cursed. By any reasonable measure, she should be terrified. A little, she admitted, but not of your father, and not of becoming your mother. I'm scared of disappointing you, of not being enough. Emma tilted her head with the wisdom that sometimes emerged from children who'd faced loss too early. Mama Emily used to say that love isn't about being perfect. It's about trying every day to be better than you were yesterday. The words, spoken in Emily's memory rather than her shadow, brought tears to Virginia's eyes. She pulled Emma close, breathing in the scent of soap and childhood innocence. Your first mama was very wise. She was, but Papa's happier now that you're here. We all are. Downstairs, the house buzzed with activity. Dr. Morrison had agreed to perform the ceremony, bringing with him a progressive theology that emphasized God's love over man's judgment. Mrs. Patterson directed the preparation of a simple wedding breakfast, while Tom Bradley and several other supporters from town helped Benjamin arrange furniture to accommodate the small gathering. Not everyone had come, of course. Colonel Harper and his inner circle remained notably absent, their disapproval hanging over the celebration like storm clouds on the horizon. But more people had shown up than Benjamin had dared hope. Mill workers with their families, several of the younger veterans. Even Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house and had quietly defied the colonel's directive that no one provide aid or comfort to the Blackwood household. "Are you ready for this?" Benjamin asked as Virginia appeared at the top of the stairs, the blue of her dress making her eyes shine like jewels in the morning light. "I think I've been ready my whole life," she replied, and meant it. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted in the main room of the house, with the 4 children gathered close and the February sun streaming through windows that Virginia had cleaned until they sparkled. Dr. Morrison spoke of love as a choice rather than a feeling, of families built on commitment rather than blood, of the courage required to choose mercy in a world that often preferred judgment. When Benjamin slipped Emily's wedding ring onto Virginia's finger, a gesture that should have felt wrong but somehow felt perfectly right, he spoke his vows with the quiet intensity of a man who'd learned not to waste words on anything that didn't matter. "I promise to honor you not because society demands it, but because you deserve it. I promise to love you not despite your struggles, but because of the strength you've shown in facing them. And I promise to build a family with you that's founded on choice rather than obligation, on grace rather than genetics." Virginia's vows were simpler but no less heartfelt. "I promise to love your children as if they were born of my own heart, because in every way that matters they are. I promise to stand with you against whatever challenges come, and I promise to never stop believing that love can triumph over fear if people are brave enough to choose it." The kiss that sealed their marriage was witnessed by children who cheered and adults who applauded. But more importantly, it was witnessed by the ghost of Emily Blackwood, whose presence Virginia felt not as a burden, but as a blessing. A reminder that love could expand to include rather than exclude, that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the future. The celebration that followed was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Benjamin could see Colonel Harper riding up the path with Robert Mitchell and 2 other men, their faces set in the grim lines of people who'd come to deliver an ultimatum. "Stay here," Benjamin told Virginia, but she shook her head. We face this together. That's what marriage means." They stepped onto the porch as a united front, Virginia's hand tucked securely into Benjamin's arm, while the children gathered behind them like a small army of witnesses. The symbolism was clear. This was a family, complete and unashamed, ready to defend what they'd built together. "Benjamin," Colonel Harper's voice carried the weight of final authority, "this farce has gone on long enough. The town council has voted. Your marriage is not recognized by this community, and your continued defiance of moral order cannot be tolerated." "What exactly are you saying, Colonel?" Benjamin's voice was steady, dangerous. "I'm saying that your business contracts are hereby terminated. Your family is no longer welcome in Cedar Falls proper. And if you persist in this arrangement, we'll be forced to seek legal intervention regarding the welfare of your children." The threat hung in the cold air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Benjamin felt Virginia tense beside him, saw the way her free hand moved protectively toward Thomas, who gurgled contentedly in her arms. "You want to take my children?" Benjamin's voice dropped to the level of controlled fury that had once made Confederate soldiers think twice about advancing across an open field. "We want to save them," Pastor Williams interjected, his pale face flushed with righteous fervor. "From the corruption of being raised by a woman who mocks God's design, who teaches them that barrenness is acceptable, that defying divine will is admirable." It was Emma who broke the tension, stepping forward with the fearless courage of a child who decided that some things were worth fighting for. "You can't take us away," she announced, her young voice carrying across the yard with crystal clarity. "Virginia is our mother now. We chose her, and she chose us, and that's more real than anything you wrote down on your stupid papers." "Emma," Benjamin began, but his daughter wasn't finished. "You buried her in the snow like she was garbage," Emma continued, her words hitting the men with the force of absolute truth. "But she's not garbage. She's the person who sings to us when we have nightmares, who fixes our clothes when they tear, who makes Papa smile again. If that's wrong, then I don't want to be right." Jake and Lucy stepped forward to flank their sister, their 3-year-old faces set in identical expressions of stubborn determination. Even Thomas seemed to sense the moment, reaching out from Virginia's arms toward the men who threatened his family with a baby's complete lack of fear. Colonel Harper looked at the children, then at the adults watching from the porch, then at the small crowd of supporters who had gathered for the wedding and now stood as witnesses to his ultimatum. Something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first recognition that his version of righteousness might not be as universally accepted as he'd believed. "This isn't over," he said finally, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Benjamin replied quietly. "You can revoke my contracts, ban me from your stores, write me out of your community records, but you can't touch my family. You can't break what we've built here, and you can't bury love, no matter how deep you dig the hole." As the men rode away, their defeat evident in the slump of their shoulders and the silence that had replaced their righteous anger, Virginia felt something settle in her chest that she'd never experienced before. Not just safety, though that was part of it. Not just love, though that was certainly present. But belonging, the deep, unshakable knowledge that she had found her place in the world, and that nothing could dislodge her from it. "So," Benjamin said as they watched the last of their opponents disappear into the winter landscape, "what do you think? Ready to be a lumber baron's wife?" Virginia laughed, the sound carrying across the snow-covered yard like music. "I think I'm ready for anything, as long as we face it together." "Together," Benjamin agreed, and kissed her again, while their children cheered and the future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten story, full of possibility and promise. That evening, as they sat by the fire with the children finally asleep and the house quiet around them, Virginia found herself thinking about the girl she'd been before Robert Mitchell, before the miscarriages, before the tribunal that had buried her alive. That girl had dreamed of a family, of children who would call her mother, of a man who would value her for who she was rather than what she could produce. "Penny, for your thoughts," Benjamin said, settling beside her on the sofa they'd moved closer to the hearth. "I was just thinking," Virginia replied, leaning into his warmth, "that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. If Robert hadn't abandoned me, if the town hadn't buried me, if you hadn't been riding home that night, we never would have found each other," Benjamin finished. "Maybe that's what grace really looks like. Not preventing tragedy, but redeeming it." Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the Blackwood house, a family slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that love had triumphed over judgment, that mercy had defeated cruelty, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories began with the darkest chapters. And in the morning, they would wake as husband and wife, mother and father, children and parents. A family not born of blood or convenience, but forged in the crucible of choice and tempered by the fire of love that refused to be extinguished. And so, across the frozen landscape of Washington Territory, another tale finds its ending. Not in the grave they dug for Virginia Mitchell, but in the love that pulled her from it. This story reminds us that family isn't always born from blood, but from the daily choice to love unconditionally. That worth isn't measured by what we can produce, but by the compassion we show to others, and that sometimes the most beautiful redemptions come wrapped in the most unlikely packages. Virginia thought she was cursed for being barren, but she discovered that some women aren't meant to give birth. They're meant to give life to children who've already lost everything. Benjamin thought his heart was buried with Emily, but he learned that love doesn't replace what we've lost. It builds upon it, creating something even more beautiful. Have you ever felt judged for things beyond your control? Have you witnessed love triumph over society's cruel standards? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story of second chances and chosen family touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Out here in the Wild West, there are still so many stories of courage, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit waiting to be told. Because sometimes the most profound truths are found not in what we're born with, but in what we choose to build with our own two hands. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for riding with us.